Okay, so now we're going to start on week 4's lecture material, which involves Keynes, the textbook Keynesians. Essentially, it is the textbook Keynesian interpretation of what Keynes said. Now, at the end of this lecture, I'm going to go over the differences between what Keynes actually said, what we covered in week 3, and the textbook Keynesians, what they said. Okay? Many people in the world today, many economists, believe that this model, what we're about to go over, really bears no relationship to what Keynes said. And to support that position, which is what I agree with, the man who actually invented the textbook Keynesian model, his name is John Hicks. He wrote an article in 1938, I believe, called Mr. Keynes and the Classics. And subsequently, many years later, 30, 40 years later, right before his death, he wrote an article saying ISLM, which is what this is sometimes known as, ISLM, which you'll find out why if you take intermediate macro. But he wrote an article called ISLM, a recantation. Recantation meaning he takes it back, right? So the guy who invented this actually took it back and said, you know, I thought I had interpreted Keynes correctly, but I was in fact wrong. Okay? Now, however, despite the fact that the guy who invented it actually said, I think this isn't exactly what Keynes said, this is still taught in every university in the country and around the world. It is also the dominant economic model that economists abide by today. Okay? Essentially, if we do a little bit of history, as I always like to do, what happened was so Keynes publishes the general theory in 1936. Okay, monumental book, blows the profession wide open. Okay, people started questioning fundamental assumptions of the neoclassical model, saying, whoa, this neoclassical model, maybe it's wrong. This Keynes guy is completely different, and he seems to have an answer for the Great Depression, which was obviously very important, as I've talked about, right? 30% unemployment, bread lines. People are starting to think maybe the country should be socialist instead of capitalist, right? So amidst that backdrop, what we see is a movement with Keynes, right, where some people said, okay, maybe Keynes isn't as different as we thought he was. Maybe we can take some of the main messages of Keynes and fit it into a neoclassical model, okay? So that's where you get what's called the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis, which I would argue is not Keynesian at all, okay? We'll see why throughout the course of this lecture. But essentially, the main difference was between Keynes and the neoclassicals, right? The neoclassicals said that the level of employment was determined by the labor market. Keynes said the level of employment was determined by the level of effective demand. Okay? Related to that was this idea that the neoclassical model said there is a self-adjusting mechanism in the economy. That is, if the economy is thrown out of equilibrium for some reason, if there's a surplus or a shortage, such as a surplus of workers, which would be called unemployment, then what would end up happening is supply and demand curves would adjust accordingly, and what you would end up getting is equilibrium. So the market will take care of everything, according to neoclassicals. The neoclassicals believe that there's no room for government intervention whatsoever. The market will always lead to full employment, right? Well, Keynes said, no, that's completely wrong. If the level of spending isn't high enough, then you will never get to full employment, so you probably will always need government intervention. So you have Keynes on the one hand, there is no self-adjusting mechanism in the market, and the neoclassicals on the other hand, who say the economy is self-adjusting, you don't need government. Okay? What the contribution of the textbook Keynesians was is that they managed to put together this self-adjusting mechanism with government intervention and formulate it as the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis. Now, as I've mentioned before, I disagree with this. You can agree with it. It's completely fine. I think it suffers from some major shortcomings that we're going to see during this lecture are related to its neoclassical foundations. Okay? It really, in my opinion, the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis, or the textbook Keynesian, or the bastard Keynesian theory really is neoclassical in origin, and it just changes some things around the fringe to make it seem like it's Keynesian, but it really isn't Keynesian. It's simply a neoclassical model with a few slight changes. Okay? So let's start there. And on the board, I've drawn a diagram, okay, which is the core of the textbook Keynesian model. Okay? This is called the 45-degree diagram, which I think you might be able to see it over here. It says 45 degrees. These are just my lecture notes on the right, so for me, just for my head, so you don't have to worry about reading the right side of the board. But it all starts with the 45-degree diagram. Okay? Now in this diagram, it's named the 45-degree diagram because of this line right here, which is a 45-degree line. Okay? 45 degrees here, 45 degrees here, 90 total. Okay? On the vertical axis, I've put aggregate expenditure, which sort of sounds like Keynes, right? Total amount of spending. Okay. And then on the horizontal axis, I've put Y for income. Okay. So we have aggregate expenditure and income. Sounds like Keynes to me. So far, so good. Okay. The 45-degree line, represents all the points of equilibrium where spending is equal to income. Okay? So for every point along this line, spending is equal to income. Okay? Now, let's draw a point right here called YF, which will stand for the full employment level of income. Okay? YF. I've also put in a consumption function, okay, which we are familiar with from Keynes. Here's an important point. The one thing that I believe is completely identical between Keynes and the textbook Keynesians is the treatment of consumption. Okay? They have the same exact consumption theory. That's a similarity between the two. Okay? Which wasn't really that hard to come up with. I mean, Keynes' consumption theory was simple, right? You have C, a consumption function, and the total amount of consumption is equal to A, which stands for autonomous consumption, right? Just stuff you're going to buy no matter what your income level, right? Your water, food, clothing, and shelter, okay? So total amount of consumption is equal to autonomous consumption plus discretionary consumption. And discretionary consumption is how much you spend out of your total income, okay, out of your expected income. So Y, your expected income, and B, we've seen that B is the marginal propensity to consume. Okay, so if the MPC is 0.8, if B is 0.8, and Y goes up by $10, if you expect to make $10 more, then you're going to end up increasing your consumption by $8. Okay? So I've drawn the consumption function into this diagram. Okay? We have A, which acts as the y-intercept. Okay? It's the y-intercept because it's that level of spending that level of aggregate expenditure, autonomous consumption, is going to happen regardless of your income level. Okay? So if you make $0 of income, you're still going to buy food, clothing, and shelter, right? So if you make no income, you're still going to be spending something on autonomous consumption. Okay? So that's where I get A from, which is the y-intercept. Next, I've drawn a line, which is our consumption function. It's upward sloping because as your income goes up, your consumption goes up as well, right? Because as by, right? If y goes from 0 to 10, and then 10 to 50, and then 50 to 100,000, your consumption will go up as well, right? Because if you had no income, you're not going to buy a steak. But if you have an income of $50, you might go out and buy one steak. And then if you make $100,000, you might buy 10, 12, 15 steaks. Okay? So this line, the consumption function, is upward sloping because consumption is increasing. Okay? So this goes up because as your income goes up, you will end up consuming more. Okay? So that's where our consumption function is. Now we have to talk about investment. Okay? Remember, I said that Keynes's book, The General Theory, in that book, about this much was talking about consumption, and about this much talks about investment. Okay? With the textbook Keynesian model, or the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis model, very little is really said about investment. Okay? More or less, some of this will change slightly when you get to intermediate, but for the most part, with any given interest rate, okay, for any given interest rate, so if the interest rate is 5%, then the textbook Keynesians say that there will be a fixed amount of investment. Okay? So all that stuff Keynes was talking about with expectations, etc., things like that, is not really present in the textbook Keynesian model. Okay? Keynes, remember, said if you expect to make money, then you're going to invest, but if you think the economy is about to tank, well, then you prefer liquidity more than an investment, so you're going to hold money instead of spending it, right? And if you hold money, then that doesn't make cash registers go off, and nobody generates sales, okay? So that's a major difference, right? Because these guys say that, don't worry, the level of investment will be relatively constant, whereas Keynes said, no, the level of investment is going to go up and down considerably based upon someone's expectations. Okay? And so, since what Keynes said, since the economy, since investment goes up and down based on someone's expectations, that will cause the economy to go up and down based off of people's expectations. Okay? So that's a major difference between Keynes and the textbook Keynesians. Keynes said that investment was very volatile. The textbook Keynesians, let me backtrack a little bit even. Keynes said that investment was very volatile, and that is what would change the level of effective demand, which would change the level of employment. Okay? The textbook Keynesians, on the other hand, say that investment, for any given interest rate, investment will be constant. Okay? So if investment is constant for any given interest rate, well then what makes the economy go up and down? It can't be changes in the level of spending, like what Keynes said, right? Keynes said investment goes up and down, spending goes up and down, so employment goes up and down. The textbook Keynesians are going to say that investment is constant. So then why does employment go up and down? We'll see the answer to that a little bit later. It's called the Phillips curve, okay? Which is where it gets back to being neoclassical, okay? Where the textbook Keynesians really merge with the neoclassical model, okay? So, investment is said to be constant. For any given interest rate, the textbook Keynesians say there's a given level of investment. Okay? So, I'm drawing a line here, labeled I for investment, and it's constant, right? If your income level is 0, then this amount of investment will be happening. If this is the level of income, then investment will still be at the same level. Same here, okay? So, now we can add up consumption and investment to get our total level of aggregate expenditure, okay? The total level of aggregate expenditure is simply C plus I. So that's what I'm going to do now. And I'm going to simply add a constant. Imagine that there's $50 worth of investment. I'm just going to add 50 on top of our consumption function. So they're going to be the same space apart from one another. Okay? I've labeled that C plus I. Okay? The distance between the consumption function and C plus I is simply the height of investment, or the quantity of investment. Okay? So now I'm going to erase the consumption function and our investment line. Okay? Because I have them both represented right here. Okay, so now we have a line, C plus I. C plus I can also be called aggregate expenditure. Okay, it's the total level of expenditure. Consumption plus investment. Sounds Keynesian so far, doesn't it? Sounds like Keynes. With one important difference though, right? Consumption plus investment, Keynes called effective demand. Textbook Keynesians call consumption plus investment aggregate expenditure. But it more or less sounds like the same thing, right? It's consumption and investment. The important difference to remember is that here, for a given interest rate, right? If the interest rate is 5%, investment is constant, okay? Keynes, on the other hand, said something completely different. Keynes said that, sure, the interest rate could be 5%, but if you expect to make 10% by buying a car machine or car factory, then that's what you're going to do. On the other hand, so there will be a lot of investment and a lot of spending, which generates a lot of employment. On the other hand, for the same interest rate for Keynes, if the interest rate is 5%, but nobody expects to make any money from selling cars, right? If you only expect to make 2% from cars, then there's going to be no investment and everyone will just hold money. Okay? So so there will be less investment, which means employment will go down. Oh, the light went off. those sensors are too sensitive. I hope that doesn't happen again. Okay, so for Keynes, right, if you expect to make 10% by buying a car factory, then you're going to, and the interest rate is 5%, then you'll invest a lot, which means spending goes up and employment goes up. But on the other hand, if you expect to only make 2%, right, if the economy isn't doing that well, you only expect to make 2%, then what you're going to do is you're actually going to hold on to money, even though the interest rate is the same, at the same level. It's still 5%. But if you expect to not make a lot of money by selling cars, you'll just hold on to your money at 5%, which means investment goes down, spending goes down, and employment goes down. Okay? So that's a big difference between Keynes and the textbook Keynesians. Keynes said that there really is no functional relationship. There's no relationship between the interest rate and investment. Okay? He said it all depends on your expectations. If you expect to make money, then that's good. People will invest. If you don't expect to make money, then people aren't going to invest. Okay? The textbook Keynesians would simply say, if the interest rate goes up or down, there's going to be the same amount of investment, right? At 5%, you're going to get a constant level of investment. So that's very different from what Keynes said. Okay? Point being, even though the textbook Keynesians have C plus I, and Keynes had C plus I, while the consumption, while the C is the same, right? That's the similarity between Keynes and the textbook Keynesians, is consumption. They both treat consumption identically. Their treatment of investment is radically different, okay? They would not agree at all on the way investment is handled, okay? Just incidentally, some of you may wonder, well, why didn't Keynes get involved in these debates? Keynes died in 1945, I believe, or 46. After he wrote the general theory, a few years later, World War II broke out, right? So from 1936 to 1938, he was writing about the general theory and he was actively involved in economic debates. But when World War II broke out, he went to go work for England to help to figure out how they could pay for the war, things like that. Okay, so he was tied up with government work. The war ended and he died. Okay, he was a very tall man. He was tall and very thin, so he had a bad heart. And so he died in 1945 or 46. So he was never around for any of these debates. So he never had a chance to really say, listen, you've got investment dead wrong. Okay? What ended up happening is he went to go work for England, right, during the war, which was obviously more important. And then he ended up dying. Okay? So, that's just a little background information, you know. So, consumption plus investment in the textbook Keynesian model, that gives us the aggregate level of expenditure, okay? Aggregate level of expenditure, we call it aggregate expenditure. Wherever consumption plus investment crosses the 45-degree line, so right there, we say that that is the equilibrium level of income and employment. Okay? So, this still sort of seems to be like Keynes, right? Even though investment is different, which I mentioned, just went over, here we have a situation where consumption plus investment, which we call aggregate expenditure, this is our aggregate expenditure line, aggregate expenditure is crossing the 45-degree line, and when it crosses that, our equilibrium level of income and employment is not the same as the full employment level of income. Okay? It means that there are people who are unemployed. Okay? So how do we fix that? Well, the textbook Keynesians said you could use government spending. Still sort of sounds like Keynes, okay? So they said in order to get to full employment, the government should spend. If the government was going to spend, then that would increase, then that would increase the aggregate level of expenditure. Okay? So let's put a government in. Let's just say that the government has a constant level of spending. It spends the same amount every year. You can figure out whatever the optimal level is, but it spends the same amount every year. If we do that, then we can add government to C plus I. Okay? It'll become C plus I plus G. And we can draw another line right here. Where can I label this? Okay? We can put the line in right there, C plus I plus G. So that's consumption plus investment, which was aggregate expenditure, but now we added in government spending. Okay? Building dams, roads, tanks, whatever. Okay? So consumption plus investment plus government is now our new level of aggregate expenditure. Okay? Our total level of expenditure. Become this. Wherever this line, and I'll label these as AE1, which was our first C plus I, and then AE2, which will be aggregate expenditure for consumption, investment, and the government. Okay? So that's AE2. Where AE2 crosses the 45-degree line, we can say that that is the full employment level of income. Okay? We'll just assume the government spends enough to fill the gap between our previous level of income and the full employment level of income. Okay? So even though the textbook Keynesians have a different investment theory than Keynes, it still seems like they come to the same conclusions, right? They have consumption, investment is different, okay, investment's different, but they still said that consumption plus investment, AE1, could not be enough to get to the full employment level of output and employment, okay? It might fall short. Aggregate expenditure might not be enough to get the economy to full employment. So how do you fix that? Well, they said government could step in, and if the government steps in and increases aggregate expenditure, well then that might be able to get us to full employment. Okay? So that sort of sounds Keynesian. Okay? And despite the fact that there are problems with their investment theory, okay, it does sound like Keynes, right? The general idea is the government can increase spending to get the economy to full employment. Okay, they don't have a very good investment theory, right? The level of investment is constant, but they have the government getting involved in the economy to achieve full employment, right? That doesn't sound very neoclassical, at least. Right? The neoclassicals would say the level of employment is determined in the labor market. Here, the textbook Keynesians are saying, no, the level of employment and income is determined not in the labor market, it's determined by the level of aggregate expenditure. Okay? So that, it seems okay. So far, so good. Right? There's problems with investment, we've established that. I don't have to beat the horse to death, I'm sure. But even though the level of investment investment theory is far different from Keynes, it still sounds like Keynes, right? If consumption and investment aren't high enough, then aggregate expenditure won't get the economy to full employment, okay? So, unlike the neoclassical theory, which has a self-adjusting mechanism, here, in the textbook Keynesian model, there is no self-adjusting mechanism, right? They're saying if the level of spending isn't at the full employment level, then the government should get involved and spend until you are at the full employment level of income and output. Okay? So, this does sound very much like Keynes. Okay? Here's the twist, okay, where it becomes the neoclassical synthesis. The textbook Keynesians started saying, well, do we really want to get all the way to full employment? In fact, if we get to full employment, that might cause inflation. And inflation could make spending go down even more. Okay? In other words, if prices are going up, then people won't be able to buy as many things as they used to, right? If the price of a water bottle goes up, and if the price of a phone goes up, things like that, then they won't be able to buy as much as they used to. So therefore, we really need, which will make aggregate expenditure go down, which will actually cause the economy to get worse. Okay? This is an idea called the Phillips curve, or led to an idea called the Phillips curve. It is the reason why America has never had full employment outside of World War II. And the only reason we had full employment during World War II is because we took half the population, put them in a uniform, and shipped them over to Europe, and then we took the other half of the population, stuck them in a factory to make the guns and the uniforms and all that stuff that was going to bring them over to Europe. Okay? The Phillips curve is why, at least since the mid-70s, we have been so concerned about inflation in this country that we've missed the idea that maybe we should care about unemployment. Okay? And you're going to learn the Phillips curve in a couple minutes. I'm just going over the history of it. Starting in the 70s, people really started caring about inflation. Okay? And the whole focus of macroeconomics went from employment, which is why it was created. Remember, John Maynard Keynes invented macroeconomics, and he said what you need to care about, okay, the variable of interest is employment. Okay? He said the more employment you have, the better off the economy will be. And many, 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 many empirical studies have been done which show that he was right. However, the Phillips curve came up with the idea that we need to have some group of people who are unemployed, because if we get to full employment, then there may actually be inflation. And if there's inflation, that will lower aggregate expenditure, so we may actually go from full employment back to our original equilibrium, Y star, right? So I'm going to cover this idea now, and I'm going to show you exactly what the Phillips curve is. Before we get to that, I want to just point out something with the neoclassical model, because I'm going to try to show you how the textbook Keynesian model really is neoclassical in nature. Okay? It's called the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis. What I'm going to try to do is, I'm going to show you, and then I argued, it's really not that Keynesian. Why is it not Keynesian? Or why is it not Keynes? Well, one, investment, right? The treatment of investment is different. Keynes said investment is very volatile, and the textbook Keynesian said that it's constant. Okay? I didn't get into that too much because it could become a technical argument, and that wouldn't be appropriate for an intro class. Okay, so that's something you have to take my word at. If you want to know more about it, feel free to email me. But I also then argued that not only is it not Keynesian, it really is just a neoclassical model with some tweaks around the edges. Okay? So in order to show you that, I need to demonstrate how the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis really is neoclassical, which means we need to look at something in the neoclassical model. Okay? In the neoclassical model, we said that the level of employment is determined by the labor market. And that level of employment is always the full employment level. Okay? So in the neoclassical model, the economy is always at full employment. That is, the government doesn't need to get involved, right? Because the economy is always at full employment, and if you want a job, it's there waiting for you. If you choose not to work, it's because you're lazy, right? That wage is there, it's set, and if you want a job, there will be one waiting for you. Okay, so the only people without jobs are those who aren't hardworking and diligent. Okay? Now, I forget if I mentioned this in my week 3's lecture, but Piero Sraffa in 1956 and 1960 wrote a book that basically showed there are hundreds of problems with the neoclassical labor market. Okay, it's wrong. He showed, and in fact, the biggest proponents of the neoclassical model back in 1956 and 1960, they admitted they were wrong. Okay? It's still taught to this day, and people believe it, even though people have admitted that it's wrong. Okay? That would be like teaching the physics of Isaac Newton after Albert Einstein came along, right? Einstein showed that Newton had severe problems. Okay? You teach things that are wrong, even though we know they're wrong. Okay? So, we have full employment in the neoclassical labor market, which is wrong, but it's still taught. So, and the reason I teach it to you is because I know everyone else is going to teach it, and so I would be putting you at a disadvantage if I didn't teach it to you. Okay? But we have full employment in this fictitious neoclassical labor market. Okay? Then I said, what determines the level of output? Well, the level of output is determined by the production function. Okay? So we said our production function looks like this. Okay? In fact, I'm going to draw it down here, because I'm going to need board space up here. Let me just make sure you can see that. Okay. Okay, so we mentioned that output is a function of technology, capital, and labor. Okay? Well, I also said that the capital stock was fixed, right? That's one of the assumptions behind the production function. The level of capital is fixed. Entrepreneurs know exactly how much capital they should have because they're the smartest guys in the room. If they had too little or too much capital, then they wouldn't be the smartest guys in the room, and that can't happen because businessmen are the smartest people in the room, according to this theory at least. Now, the second big assumption is that we're at the full employment level of labor, okay? that labor is fully employed. So we have NF, okay? What that allows us to do is say that we have the full employment level of output, okay? Full employment level of output. And that level is fixed, okay? This is important to remember. The level of output is fixed no matter what. So the economy is always making as much as we can. So let's think about that in terms of a supply curve. The neoclassical supply curve, right? We have price and income, or price and quantity, just like the supply and demand we did in chapter 2, or week 2, okay? We have price, we have income, okay? Well, if the economy is always making the maximum amount of stuff, then the neoclassical theory, the neoclassical model says the supply curve, the aggregate supply curve, is vertical. Now, let's do this. Okay. YF is the full employment level of output, right? Full employment level of output, okay? So regardless, now let's think about this conceptually. If the labor market produces full employment, capital stock is fixed, we have full employment, okay? That leads us to say that we're making the full employment level of output. So if everyone in the economy is working together, all these businesses are working together, and what they're producing is as much stuff as we can actually produce. Okay? If we say we're producing as much as we actually can, then what you end up getting is this is the level of output, right? We're producing as much as we can, regardless of what the price level is, right? Doesn't matter. For the neoclassicals, prices are unrelated to output, okay? Remember, in the neoclassical model, prices are determined by the quantity theory of money. That is, MV equals PY, right? MV equals PY. That's what determines prices for the neoclassical model. So nowhere here have I mentioned output, right? The relationship between prices and output. We said that output's constant, right? Velocity is constant. And so therefore the government, which is assumed to control the money supply, they actually don't, which we're going to talk about next week, but we assume they control the money supply. Well, then any change in money leads to a change in price, okay? But this is completely separate from this. Right? Full employment level of output because we have full employment in the labor market, okay? Prices are determined by the quantity theory. Output is determined by the production function. So there's a big difference. So regardless of what level the prices are, right, no matter what level the prices get to, we're still producing this amount of output. Okay? So this is the aggregate supply curve. Okay? In the neoclassical model, the aggregate supply curve is vertical. Okay? In chapter 2, when we were looking at supply and demand, or week 2, sorry. When we were talking about supply and demand, we said that the supply curve is shaped like this. Okay? Well, neoclassicals say, nah, the supply curve isn't shaped like that, it's vertical. Okay? They both agree on supply and demand, but they think, the slopes are different, okay? So they say, the neoclassicals would say that the aggregate supply curve is vertical. For those who are looking for real technicality, neoclassicals say the long run aggregate supply curve is vertical, but we're not distinguishing between that. It's just an intro class, okay? So, you have the price level, which is determined by the quantity theory of money, and we have the production function, which determines the level of output. Okay? That has produced the result in which we say that the aggregate supply curve is vertical in the neoclassical model. Okay? So, now that we're talking about an aggregate supply curve that's vertical, well then what ends up determining the level of output? Well, the production function, right? The level of output is simply determined by okay? Remember, full employment, capital, full employment. So the level of output, or the aggregate supply curve, is determined by the production function. Which means one big thing, at least for our Keynes, textbook Keynesian discussion. It means that the level of output is not determined, right? If the neoclassicals would say, the level of output is not determined by aggregate demand. Okay? Whether you want to call it aggregate expenditure or effective demand, they would disagree with that entire idea altogether, right? They would say the level of spending has neoclassicals, that is. Neoclassicals would say the level of spending has nothing to do with determining the level of output. Okay? The level of output is determined by the production function. It is not, excuse me, excuse me, they would say the level of output is not determined by aggregate demand, which you can see right here. We have an aggregate demand curve, right? Well, let's see what happens if there was an increase of aggregate demand. If aggregate demand went up, you would end up having the same amount of output, right? You'd have the same amount of output, but higher prices, right? Prices would have gone up, okay? So what that led them to say was that aggregate demand has no impact whatsoever on the level of output and employment. This is what neoclassicals believed. I've gone through this so much, okay, because I'm going to try to show you how the textbook Keynesians, okay, the textbook Keynesians, who I just mentioned, sort of, believe that the level of spending determined income. I'm going to try to show you how they actually ended up merging with the neoclassicals and became the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis, which is very different from what Keynes was. And the whole way in which I'm going to show you this is the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis also believed in a vertical supply curve. Okay? The neoclassicals, way back in 1870, had a vertical supply curve. That idea went away for a while with Keynes. Okay? Keynes said, look around. This is what a supply curve is probably shaped like. Okay? when you go and you buy more Coca-Cola, right? The price of Coca-Cola doesn't suddenly go up in the machine, right? You buy a Coke, the price doesn't go up. Well, that's what neoclassicals would say, right? Neoclassicals would say, well, there's less Coke in the machine. That means it is relatively scarce, so the price goes up, okay? Well, Keynes said, no. Businesses set prices, right? Other than stocks, things like that, where the prices are what you call flexible, Keynes said, no, prices are fixed. They're set by companies. And this is obvious. Coca-Cola charges $1.50 for every can of Coke. The price doesn't magically go up and down, okay? So Keynes said, for the most part, a supply curve is horizontal, okay? And then once you start getting to full employment, I'll make this the vertical portion, full employment. He said once you start getting to full employment, then prices could go up, but that would be way towards full employment, when you have, say, 1% unemployment, things like that, okay? Keynes said, yeah, too much spending can lead to inflation, but it'll lead to inflation once you're at full employment, okay? Until then, increasing aggregate demand will actually cause income to go up, okay? So for Keynes, increasing aggregate demand causes income to go up, right? You go from here to here. That's completely different from neoclassicals. Who say aggregate demand has nothing to do with it. You have a vertical supply curve. This is aggregate demand. And if you were to increase aggregate demand, all that would do is raise prices, okay? So as we'll see, one of the big differences is Keynes had this idea that a supply curve was horizontal. Why? Because businesses set prices. The neoclassicals, on the other hand, said that a supply curve is vertical because they said output was determined by the production function, okay? So, in order to show you how the textbook Keynesians turned into the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis, we need to look at this Phillips curve idea, okay? It's a theory called the Phillips curve, and with the Phillips curve, you saw a vertical supply curve be reintroduced to what was a Keynesian framework. So, in this textbook Keynesian framework, right? The textbook Keynesians said, okay, consumption plus investment, or what I've labeled as aggregate expenditure 1, I should also label the 45-degree line. Consumption plus investment, or what I've labeled as aggregate expenditure 1, if there's enough spending there, you'll have Y star, or an equilibrium. But if that falls short of the full employment level of income, then you might need the government to step in, which would get you to aggregate expenditure 2, okay? Which maybe if the government stepped in, you could have more and more spending. Okay? So this, more and more spending, which means you would have more and more income and employment. That sounds a lot more like Keynes, right? Aggregate demand matters here. Okay? What they did, what the textbook Keynesians did, when they tweaked their model, they tried to put this into a neoclassical framework. And when they tried that, they ran into problems surrounding the vertical supply curve, right? A vertical supply curve says aggregate demand has no impact on employment. Employment is determined in the labor market, right? This is just neoclassical theory. Well, so far, the textbook Keynesians are saying, well, the level of income and employment is determined by aggregate expenditure. Okay? So they wanted to be in this they wanted to come up with a framework that would be put into the neoclassical model, but they ran into trouble surrounding the vertical aggregate supply curve. Okay? This is why the Phillips curve was such a huge discovery, or creation would be a better word. The Phillips curve was a huge creation because it allowed this model to be inserted into a neoclassical framework. Okay? So, I'm going to stop the camera. I think we're at about an hour and 15 now. I'm going to stop the camera. You guys can take a break, whatever. And then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about how the textbook Keynesians became the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis. Okay? We're going to talk about the Phillips curve, and then we're going to talk about the real balance effects. There's two real balance effects. There's an indirect and there's a direct. Okay? We're going to talk about those when I come back.